And so as we begin the series entitled Stories, you see the tagline below, life is beautifully complicated. You know, we're not all characters in a book, in a movie. Oftentimes you watch a movie and you can tell pretty quickly, oh, this is the bad guy, this is the good guy. And we can't like the bad guy too much because that's not going to sell the movie well. We got to, oh yeah, here's something he did. We snuck in, the camera found him doing something that he wasn't supposed to do, and now we know, oh, he's the bad guy. But life is not that simple. See, we all struggle with being the good guy and the bad guy, and I'm speaking generally, good girl, bad girl. We all struggle with being on top and on the bottom, maybe daily. We're doing right, we're doing well, we're on the right track, we're making the right decisions, and then the next day we're not, or even the very same day. Life is good and great, and we're wonderful, and it's awesome, and then the next day something else happens, and it's bad and it's tough. See, we're all what's called a round character. When I say round, I don't mean like round like my belly that I'm working on, but round as in we're complex. We're not flat characters where everything is the same. And as we look into Scripture and as we hear from our own people, I pray that becomes more and more true for us. That God is going to be present with us even in our ups and downs, even in the goods and the bads. And that as we hear and dive into stories and get some of the details, we really see that come to life. That we're not all the same. We don't always have the same kind of days. We don't have the same personalities. And we're not always in the same level. And so whether you came in today and life is great, things are going well, or you came in today and it's been a tough week, a tough month, a tough year. There's been a lot of tough things we've all faced the last several years. And so God has been present throughout. And so I pray today as we jump into this series stories that each Sunday, that we'd be led to that next step and that we'd understand the complexity of our own story, right? You identify as you listen, and then of the stories of the people that we look at too in Scripture. And so today we're going to jump in right back into the Old Testament. I got my water again today. Anybody still got the allergies? There you go, Jeremiah. Thank you. John, I appreciate you putting your piano here for my water table. Today we're jumping all the way back into the Old Testament into the book of Genesis. We're looking at the person named Jacob. You got the patriarchs of the faith. Let's go all the way back. God creates Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve have a few kids, Cain and Abel, Seth, others. The world gets more and more corrupt until we get to Noah, the time of Noah. Noah and his family is saved and rescued from the flood through the ark. A few generations after Noah, God, instead of flooding the world again to save it, to cleanse it, he takes a new path, a different plan, and he connects with a family. This is the Old Testament story of God's people, the Hebrews, the Jewish people, the Israelites. And it begins with Abraham. And so the patriarchs of the faith that you've heard before, more than likely, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham being the father of the Jewish people, he has a son Isaac. Isaac has a son Jacob. Now there's other family members mixed in, but this is the line that we're talking about. So we're talking way early on, and we're going to be looking at Jacob. So if we would, let's look to Genesis chapter 25, verse 19. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger. Let me read a few more. When the days of her birth were to be completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak, so that his name was called Esau. Afterward his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. I know I read a little further than we had on the screen. That's a little change up for me. Esau was born first. You have these twins, Jacob and Esau. Esau was hairy and red and this warrior of a man, and they called him Esau. Jacob comes out, and And he was grasping at the heel, holding on to the heel of Esau as he came out. So Jacob, Yaakov, came out next. His name really means supplanter, or quite literally it means heel grabber. So I don't know if your name's Jacob in the house, but if you are, your name means heel grabber. Heel grabber meaning always trying to reach a little further, achieve a little more, and perhaps dishonestly at times. Jacob was the supplanter, the one that always was scheming. Jacob was a cunning man, crafty, intelligent, quick-witted, willing to cheat and swindle to get his way. Willing to do things necessary to accomplish more, always grabbing at the heel of those in front of him, quite literally to his brother, but on others he would grab their heel as to pull himself further up at the expense of someone else. See, Jacob saw people as an opportunity to use them. Jacob was always trying to move forward to gain a little more power, to get closer to power, that he might achieve this by reaching and pulling himself up at the expense of others. Again, he saw people for how he could use them. I feel in a lot of ways the church today struggles in some ways with this grasping at power, this cozying up to power. Trying to grab political power, military power. Throughout the church's history, there's been many times where the church forsook some of its identity that it might cozy up with a nation, an empire, a war, going the way of power, going the way of the beast, as we've talked about before. And the church is designed to spread through testimony of faith, love of enemy, forgiveness and kindness. It's a new path, the path of peace that we follow Jesus down, the way of the Lamb. And the church is not attempting to grasp at power. It's not supposed to. Because when we do so, we grab at the sword of Caesar, if you will, to do things the way of empire, to go about things the wrong way, to not really care who's going to get hurt in the wake, as long as we can get power and have influence, and yet our influence is to come another way, a radical way, as we love and forgive those around us, even our enemies. And Jesus teaches us. But this is Jacob. And God has yet promised now that the older will serve the younger, that one will be greater than the other. Jacob is to be the one that carries this family line, this lineage. As you hear many times in the New and Old Testament where it says the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It doesn't say Esau. Jacob is the one God selects, and yet he's this cunning, crafty man that is deceitful and cheats. When Jacob and Esau were teenagers, might have been young 20s, Esau comes in right from a hunt. He's sweaty and he's starving. He's got dirt all over him, and I'm famished and he's ready to eat. And Jacob is what we call more of an indoorsy type of person. You got outdoorsy and indoorsy. Jacob is inside and he's cooking some stew. A lovely stew that fills the house with this aroma. And as Esau comes in starving, he smells this stew that his brother's cooking. And Jacob, instead of serving his brother and seeing the value of him being just a person created by God, his brother whom he loves, and giving him some stew, instead he decides to take advantage of the situation, to use Esau for his own gain. And so he says, Esau, you hungry? I made this stew just for you, but if you want some, why don't you give me your birthright? Why don't you sell me your birthright? That language doesn't mean too much to us nowadays, but in the Old Testament, this has been the understanding of the birth order, the priority. The oldest son has the birthright as the firstborn that gets the most of the will, the testament, the most of the spoils of the family. And Jacob was only the second oldest, not the oldest, and so he missed out on some of these things. So he uses this opportunity and says, Esau, give me your birthright and I'll give you this stew. Esau in the moment says, what good is my birthright to me if I'm dead? He's going to die. He's so hungry. He's being a little dramatic. But he says, fine, Jacob, you have my birthright. Give me this stew. And so he does this exchange. Jacob sees this opportunity to move ahead, to advance a little bit, to grab at the heel of Esau as he was when he was first born. A few years come and a few years go. Jacob and Esau's relationship remains somewhat tenuous. It's now gotten in the older years for their father Isaac. Isaac, it says, was 60 when they were born, and Jacob and Esau could have been around 40 at this time. So Isaac very well may be 100 years old or getting close to it. It says he's getting old, and it says his sight is growing dim. He can't quite see very well anymore. And he tells Esau, his oldest, that he wants to give him his blessing. Pass down this blessing to his oldest son. So he says, Esau, come in. I want you to go out into the field. I want you to hunt some wild game. Prepare me a meal. Make it into a stew. Bring it in that I might be nourished. And then I'll give you my blessing. Well, Jacob and his mom, Rebekah, overhear this. And once again, Jacob concocts a plan to swindle, to move a little further up, to advance his name a little greater. He sees an opportunity at the expense of his brother and at the expense now of his father. So they decide to trick his father Isaac. So Rebekah, his mom, makes some stew. And then meanwhile, Jacob, who's nothing like his brother, he's, like I said, indoorsy. Not all hairy, smells different. So he goes and gets some of Esau's clothes, puts on his clothes. This smells like Esau. Then he goes and gets some animal skins, puts some animal skins on his arm, some animal fur so that he feels more like Esau. Esau must have been a pretty hairy dude. And he goes in and he gets the stew right from his mom and brings it in, sets it before his father and pretends to be Esau. And his father can't see very well, but he smells him, smells like Esau. He reaches out his hand and touches his arm and he feels like Esau. It must be Esau. And Isaac gives his blessing to Jacob. Now, blessing, once again, is not language that we use too often. Think of it more in terms of when someone dies and they hand down a will, right? They pass along their legacy to the next generation. It's just a way to help us think about it. You would go to the attorney's office and they would sign this document. It's a real legal thing. Obviously, they didn't have that then, so there was this verbal, oral blessing given, and it was given from Isaac down to Jacob instead of Esau. And so Esau, nonetheless, comes in a moment later with his stew, and it's like, Father, here I am with my stew. I'd love for my blessing. And his father Isaac says, I have already given my blessing. It's already been given to Jacob. He can't redo it. He can't do it again. It's been given. It's handed down now, this blessing of family, this blessing of lineage, this carrying on of the family name, this possession of adulthood, of fatherhood, of manhood that he gives down to Jacob. A blessing to prosper. The original blessing from God to Adam and Eve was that they would be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth. And this is now carried on in a way through each family. And so Esau is furious. And he says, I'm going to kill my brother Jacob. Jacob and his mom overhear this, and Jacob has to once again concoct a plan and figure out what to do. And so in fear, he gets his things and he leaves. He flees. He runs away. He decides to go to his uncle's house, Uncle Laban. In a far country, he leaves and goes to Uncle Laban's house. On his journey, he stops and has a nap, a sleep. And he has this dream. A dream maybe you've heard of before called Jacob's Ladder. Anyone heard of Jacob's Ladder before? This dream of a ladder that extends and connects earth to heaven, and on it the angels are ascending and descending. He has this dream. It's one of these first encounters that he has with God. He wakes up and he's not quite sure what this dream is about. But he knows that something has happened. Some moment in his life is now special, and he names this place where he's taken a nap Beth-El, which means house of God. Bethel. He continues on to his Uncle Laban's house where in some ways he meets his match. His Uncle Laban is a little crafty as well. A little swindling as well. Jacob would end up working for his Uncle Laban and hiding out from his family for 20 years. 20 years' time. Think about the things going on in your own life. The mistake you made, the person that you hurt, and how maybe you've run away. Maybe quite literally you ran away to a new place. That's what brought you here to Colorado. But maybe you've run away in the sense of you're hiding from it. You're hoping it never turns its face again. You're hoping you never have to encounter it again. Face the music. This is what Jacob's doing. He tricked his brother in a way that hurt him so deeply his brother wanted to kill him, and now he has to flee, and he's gone for 20 years. And for 20 years he works for his uncle Laban. Now when he first gets there, he falls in love with this daughter Rachel. Wants to marry her. And says, Laban, I'm going to work for you for a amount of time, and then maybe I'll get to marry this woman. This daughter Rachel, excuse me. And so Uncle Laban agrees and says, hey, why don't you work for me 7 years, and I'll give you my daughter's hand in marriage. And so Jacob does that. So gentlemen, think about that. Wives, girlfriends. He worked 7 years to marry this lady. So 7 years later, after a lot of hard work, it's time to marry Rachel. And so they have the ceremony, and then this is where it gets interesting. The story takes an interesting turn. The ceremony is important, certainly, but what's really important comes in terms of a marriage is consummating the marriage. Right? It happens later after the ceremony in the bedroom. And in this time, it was dark. Not a lot of light. You couldn't just turn the light switch on. The wife had her face veiled for much of the time. And so the next morning, Jacob wakes up and looks over to his new beautiful wife, Rachel, to find that ain't Rachel. It was Leah, Rachel's sister. Laban had switched daughters on Jacob, pulled a fast one on him. He had worked 7 years, and now he had married Leah. So he goes to Laban and is like, Laban, what's up? What happened here? And Laban was like, usually the oldest daughter's married first, right? Isn't that the tradition? Played it off. And says, I tell you what, you work for me another 7 years, you can marry Rachel. And Jacob agrees. So once again, ladies, if your man isn't willing to work for you for 14 years, that's what we see Jacob do. He works another 7 years and finally is able to marry Rachel. Marries this girl whom he loves. He ends up working about 6 or 7 more years for his uncle, again bringing us to around 20 years being gone. Over this time of work, Jacob has made a great name for himself. He's acquired a lot of possessions. He's in fact become quite wealthy. Many flocks and herds between now his 2 wives and their servants. It gets complicated here in the Old Testament. His 2 wives and their servants. He now has 11 children. So what he left is a young man fleeing from his brother. Now it's been 20 years and he's got wives and kids and possessions and flocks and herds and servants and all these things. And so as he's feeling good about himself, now he has this wrestling in the back of his mind, like there's this guy out there that wants me dead. How would you feel if you knew there was someone out there that wanted you dead? You wouldn't be able to be very comfortable, would you? His brother wanted him dead, and he is like, we need to reconcile. Not just for the sake of the relationship, because now he had a lot of stuff, he had a lot to lose, and he wanted to make sure that he was good with his brother. And so he makes the decision to head home. He makes the journey home, and he takes all of his possessions. He takes all of his wives and kids and flocks and herds and servants and all of this, and he begins a journey home. 20 years. He sends word to Esau, and Esau responds by saying, I'll meet you outside of the city, and I'll bring 400 men with me. So Jacob is fearful. And so that very night before he's about to get home, he sends the rest of his family and possessions across the river that they can set up camp, and he decides that he's going to stay here alone. The last night before going home, to where he potentially is going to be killed by his brother. And this night before he goes to sleep, there's a man, an interesting figure that shows up in the dark and begins to wrestle him. Out there in the wilderness, dark and can't see, and now someone shows up and begins to wrestle, and he's fighting and wrestling and struggling with this man, and he's not sure what's going on or why, and neither one seem to gain an advantage over and over, and they wrestle all night. All night they wrestle, and it's the break of day coming. The sun's about to rise, and this man is about to be revealed. Jacob didn't know who he was. And maybe it's even Esau who's come to wrestle him. And Jacob is wrestling and wrestling. All of a sudden, this man, as if to now become greater than he thought, does this special move and hits Jacob in the hip and dislocates his hip. You can just imagine the pain of a dislocated hip. Touches his hip, and his hip is now dislocated. He's in intense pain and agony, laying there, and he's just clenching, holding on to this guy. It says, he realizes you're something special. You just did this move. You were toying with me all night. Now you've dislocated my hip. And he holds onto him tight and says, if you are a great man, bless me. Give me a blessing. Still, Jacob is in this point where he's like, what can I get out of this? Now I got a limp, but how can I get something out of this? I'm going to cling to this guy. Give me a blessing. And this man blesses Jacob. And this man says, now I will change your name. No longer shall you be called Jacob, heel grabber. Now your name will be called Israel. That's where we get the nation of Israel. Israel, which means to wrestle with God. Jacob was wrestling with God. God had come down, and where he had not yet encountered him in a full way, Jacob had now encountered God through the wrestling match. And God dislocates his hip. And now Jacob has to walk with a limp. Where Jacob had once before walked with a strut, getting things his way, doing things his way, accomplishing what he needs, now Jacob is walking with a bit of a limp. His hip is taken out of socket, and he's limping. He finally has this encounter with God, and now he leaves a changed man. His name is changed, no longer heel grabber, no longer swindler, cheater, no longer how he can use people, but now his name is changed to one who wrestles with God. The next day he crosses that river and gets to where he's going to meet his brother Esau. He's nervous and scared, no doubt, but he sees his brother. I want us to see what he says here in verse 10 of Genesis chapter 33. Again, Jacob had offered possessions to his brother. Here's some things to make sure you don't get too angry with me. Jacob said, no, please, if I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. He's talking to his brother. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me. Here's what I want us to focus on of what Jacob says. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God. Jacob had always seen people for what he could get out of them. How he could trick and maneuver to gain ground, to gain an advantage, to see what he could accomplish using people. And now this is the moment after he's been changed by God. He finally has an encounter with God that leaves him different. He no longer walks with a strut, he now walks with a limp. And as he approaches his brother Esau, he says, I have seen your face, which is to see the face of God. He doesn't just see Esau as another person of someone he can use and take advantage of, and what can I get out of this? He now sees his brother Esau as one whom is loved and valued because simply he is his brother. Simply because he is a human created in God's image. To see another human is to see someone made in God's image. He reconciles with his brother. And life goes on. Jacob ends up having 12 kids altogether. These would become the 12 tribes of Israel. Again, Israel being his name now. And Jacob grows old. And his son that we read about most in the Old Testament and the rest of Genesis is Joseph. Joseph has a crazy story. This is the coat with many colors. His brothers despise him and throw him in a well, in a pit, pull him out and sell him into slavery. He goes into Egypt. We could do a whole story on Joseph, but this is to catch you up. I want to see how Jacob's life ends. Joseph leads the people, his family, to Egypt eventually. He's in prison there. He gets out, he interprets dreams, ends up serving and working in Pharaoh's court for interpreting his dream, and he rises all the way up to second in command over all of Egypt. Next only to Pharaoh himself, the most powerful man in the world. And their family now comes. Jacob, the father, and his 12 sons all come to Egypt. And Jacob has helped save a lot of people from some of his maneuvers and decisions. There was a famine in the land, and he got a lot of the grain to be saved and stored up that it would be distributed evenly in the next years during the famine. And there's a moment near the end of Jacob's life where he comes to see his brother Joseph, and his brother is with Pharaoh. Pharaoh being the most powerful person on the planet. And Jacob would always be one that would want to cozy up to this power. Oh, I'm going to meet Pharaoh himself. What can I get out of this moment? How can I get something from this? How can I use this to my advantage? How can I take advantage? And instead, this is what we see in Genesis chapter 47. I'm going to read verses 7 and verse number 10. Then Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Verse number 10. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. See, all of Jacob's life, he used people. He took advantage of people. He tricked people. He used them to gain his own ground, to advance his own name, to advance his own mission, to advance his own priorities. And this was done at the expense of others. He would cozy up to power to see what he might gain, what advantage he might get. He finally has an encounter with the Lord that leaves him different than before. He now sees the value of people because they are made in God's image. And now near the end of his life, when he has the opportunity to get before Pharaoh, think about us getting before the president, right, of the United States. This was Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, and Jacob, instead of trying to swindle and figure out what I can get out of this meeting, he simply blesses Pharaoh and leaves his presence. This is the life of Jacob changed. I have two implications for us today as we wrap up. Number one, people are valuable and deserving of dignity because they are made in the image of God. People are valuable and deserving of dignity because they are made in the image of God. How many times do we use people? Do we take advantage of people? Do we just see them for what we can get out of them? This is an unhealthy relationship, to say the least. How can I use this person to get something out of them? They're only valuable to me if they can give me something, provide something for me. This is no way to live, and it's not how God calls us to live. When we have an encounter with God, our priorities are changed in a way that now when we see people, we see their value simply because they are made in God's image, the imago Dei. God has created them and loves them, and they are valuable simply because God has created them. We are now tasked to see people in the same way. And number two, when we follow God, we walk humbly, bestowing blessings on others. When we follow God, we walk humbly, bestowing blessings on others. We don't walk with a strut. We don't walk in our pride and our arrogance, but when we encounter God truly, He changes us in a way that now maybe we're walking with a bit of a limp. It's not about us. It's how we might serve and give blessing to others. God calls us to walk humbly, not puffed up with conceit, overlording those that are in our path, but that we might serve them. Jesus fulfills this by teaching us that to love is to serve. And as we go, we don't seek of our own advantage, how we might gain our own ground, but we bestow blessings upon others. We pray for them. If we disagree with them, if we don't like them, if they get on our nerves, what do? We pray for them. We bless them. We walk humbly and we bestow blessings upon others. This is what we can learn from the life of Jacob.